Hello, welcome to AI is Dangerous. Thank you for coming today. So today we will be talking about AI, and we'll look at it kind of retrospectively and look at times when it's failed and how these failures are because of us. It's not because of the AI, it's something we did. So please ignore the Slido, we're not doing that. But we all know about how our past actions affect our future. If I get good grades, I can get into a good uni. If I save up enough money, I can buy a car that I really want. But we're often only told this on a personal level. But if it's true on a personal level, it's true for groups too. It's true for families, relationships, businesses, government, and the biggest group, society. So I guess you could say that the outcomes of our lives are based on our past decisions. So we're going to talk, as we said, I'm going to talk about AI. So what is an AI model? An AI model it's just maths. It is complicated maths, but it gives us an output based on an input given by us. And by us is the key term in that sentence. At the end of the day, it's a man-made algorithm, so when AI gets it right, it's a testament to humanity, and the creators are commended and seen to be heroes. But when AI gets it wrong, it's a failure and it's dangerous. So, when has AI failed? Let's take a look at some examples. So, the first one is hiring. So in 2019, some machine learning engineers created an AI at a multinational company to help with hiring. Now, they created this AI, they started in 2014. And in 2014, it was very big news. It was very cool that they were doing this, and they were really excited about it. And once they tested it, they found some interesting results. Every CV that contained the word women or women's was downgraded or automatically rejected by the system. Can you guess which company this was? Any ideas? Go on. Correct, it is Amazon. So, now the reason why this happened was because the AI was trained to mimic the patterns of Amazon's hiring in the last 10 years. And in the last 10 years, they had hired very few women in powerful roles in the company. Now, it's your opinion as to why this was Amazon's hiring pattern, but we can see that the disparity here is very evident. So how did they go about fixing this? They basically made the tags women and women's neutral, so it no longer affected the system. They manually went into the AI system and changed those tags. But after it had shown such blatant discrimination, it was very hard to ensure that it wouldn't discriminate in any other way. So ultimately, the project was scrapped. So, a second example. This is another example of bias, but in a different way. So, in 2015, a web developer, Jackie Alcine, was looking through his Google Photos. And in 2015, Google Photos had just introduced categorizing of images. So he was very impressed to see that graduation was on there, and he could see his little brother in his cap and his gown. And he kept looking through all of the categories, and then he came across one category of a picture of him and his friend, and the category wrote gorillas. So he thought this was a mistake. He thought it was something that he had done. So he clicks on the category and sees 73 more pictures under the same label. So once he realizes that this isn't his mistake, he immediately tweets at Google, "My friend is not a gorilla." Google's chief architect swiftly responds to this, and in a matter of hours, they've manually disabled the gorillas tag. And actually today, from my research, the gorillas tag is still manually disabled. You cannot use it, and it's never used on any categories. And it's a pretty similar approach and fix as the Amazon example. So The third example we have is a justice system. Now, a few years ago in the US, in Philadelphia specifically, an AI algorithm was implemented called COMPASS. Now, COMPASS stands for Correctional Offender Management Profiling for Alternative Sanctions. So in 2016, after testing out COMPASS for a while, they found that it was extremely biased against black defendants. Now, COMPASS would take into account previous arrests, age, employment status, and many other factors to determine every single person on there a risk rating. And what they found was black people were labeled high risk twice as much as their white counterparts. So you might be thinking, well, maybe these people actually are dangerous. Maybe the system is acting cautiously to reduce crime. Well, to validate these predictions, we'd have to look into how these scoring systems are created and whether the people on the system who are rated high risk actually acted high risk. So let's take a look at Tonya Lamyers, so a criminal justice activist. So Tonya was told by her probation officer that she needed to come in every single week. And this was very strange. She was confused because Tonya had stayed at home for 4 years, she'd stayed out of trouble, she'd got gainful employment and received 2 citations, one even from the mayor of Philadelphia. So why was she being put on such a strict probation plan? Well, COMPASS was what decided her risk rating. And COMPASS at the time had the power to overrule a judge and an appeal combined. So no matter what positive steps Tonya decided to take to her self-development, it wouldn't matter because the justice system always saw her as high risk. Upon further investigation, it was quickly determined that, like we said, COMPASS was very biased against race and class, and it would ask questions to quickly determine your race and class. And ProPublica were the first to uncover this bias, and they found that questions like, what is your postcode? Have your parents been incarcerated? Simple questions like this can easily show to COMPASS which minority each person is part of, or which group people are part of. Now, the problem with this system is that you have no idea why you're labeled as high risk. It doesn't say. And the system is often a black box, so there isn't a confident reason to say. It's based on a number of factors that we can't potentially understand. And so it's very difficult for anyone to change if they don't know what they should change. So, on to our fourth example. So this is Joy. Joy is a CS undergrad at Georgia Tech, and she decided to make a robot that played peekaboo. The project was going pretty well. It was very successful, but then she started noticing that it would never recognize her face. She didn't think much of it and assumed that someone else would solve the problem later. Then, years later, when she was at MIT, making her own project called an Aspire mirror, which was meant to project something inspiring on your face to make you feel a type of way. If you wanted to feel brave, maybe it would project like a lion on your face. So she was trying to do this Aspire mirror, and she found that it wouldn't recognize her face either. The only time it would recognize her face was when she wore this mask. Now, any thoughts as to why it would only work when she wore a white mask? Yes?
So training set bias towards people with fairer skin?
Yes, that is correct. So it is just because of the data set that it was trained on. And it sounds really simple, but after Joy did further research on this, she found this problem in her Aspire mirror, decided to do further research. She looked into data sets like Shirley cards, labeled faces in the wild, and the IBJA data set. She found that even the data sets that claimed that they had a wider geographic variation of subjects were still predominantly white. And she realized that when she was at Georgia Tech, thinking that someone will solve this later, she realized that it was going to have to be her, because nobody else had solved this in all the years that she had worked in this field. So she and an underground called Gebru, that's her last name, they have been creating a data set that was actually diverse. And they realized, as they realized most of these data sets were not diverse. So to prove that these data sets weren't diverse, they looked at 3 conventional classification systems: IBM, Microsoft, and Megvii, which is a Chinese firm, and the creators of Face++. So so they tested these, and they found that there was flawless facial recognition for one category of people. Any guesses? Any guesses? No? Okay. So, surprisingly, it was white men. So they found that, as you can see, they've got darker females here, and the results are really low if we compare that to lighter males who have got 100%, and the lowest accuracy on that is 99.2. So we can see from these findings that it's very clear that the same problem occurs in all. So Joy and Gebru decided to contact these 3 companies and see what they would say, presented the result and said, okay, here is what we found. Are you going to do anything about it? And Microsoft and Megvii did not respond. Actually, I'm wrong. Microsoft did respond, and they gave like a beautifully worded email saying about how they really respect that she responded, and they really take the time to make sure that their data sets are already diverse and they are taking steps to improve their accuracy. Megvii, radio silence. And IBM. So IBM was actually different. They did respond, and they responded so quickly and invited Joy to New York to discuss with the company about how they could improve on darker-skinned females in particular. So, some astounding improvements from this conversation happened. So we can see here that after IBM tried and improved, made it more diverse, we can see that all of them now are above 95% accuracy, whereas before we only had like 63% for one of the darker female companies. So, and even lighter females, that's gone up to now 100%. So this example is a clear example that change is possible. We just have to try, we just have to ask the right questions. And if no one had taken action to that change, then, and the previous data set continued to be used, then darker people would still be misclassified. So, now we'll talk a little bit about the different types of bias. So there are tons of different types of bias, and I won't be listing all of them, but I really like this diagram for the different types of bias. So especially for AI, I think it's really, really helpful. So you have the statistical and computational bias, human biases, and then the most tricky and the most hard to get down, which is systemic bias. Now, the definition of bias is usually a prejudice in favor or against one person or thing or group. And we'll take a look at each of the 3 categories of this bias. So, computational and statistical bias. These are a few biases to rattle them off, but I mean, the most important bias and the most detrimental one in this category is confirmation bias. Has anyone not heard of confirmation bias? No? Everyone knows it? Great. So, confirmation bias, just in case, as a recap, is where you tend to favor the information that serves your own views or that aligns with your own views. So, if a group of individuals worked on an AI system and they are all from the same demographic, they've all grown up in the same place, gone to the same schools, same political views, ethical views, then we are likely to see confirmation bias because they're surrounded with people who think exactly the same as them. And let's say if this group of people had a prejudice against women, then an output that favors this belief is most likely to be achieved. And there would seem like if these were the only people that it was tested on, that there was no issue with the model or with the product that they've created because it doesn't affect them. However, this kind of highlights like a much bigger issue in diversity, and this is exactly why we need diversity, not just in data sets, but also in the creators of AI and the people who are working on it and contributing to it. If a diverse group of people work on the same issue, we're much more likely to see these large issues resolved and systemic biases also being tackled somewhat. So it's important to remember that biases stem from our environment and that going along with our bias is commonly done, and it's a lot harder to challenge your own viewpoints. So, not that. Okay, so human and cognitive bias. So human or cognitive bias is one that has nothing to do with maths or AI. It's basically the bias that, it's about how we perceive the world around us. If anybody here does psychology or knows much about psychology, a lot of these are psychological biases. So we have anchoring bias and ostrich bias, for example. Then another one is availability heuristic bias, if anybody has heard of this. So availability heuristic bias is where what we see most frequently, we tend to think about a lot. So if we think about sharks, we see sharks a lot in the media. You have like Jaws, you have like the Megalodon documentaries, killer sharks, all of this, and we can always see media about how like sharks will tear you to pieces. Sharks can be super dangerous. And whilst we see a lot of this, it's weird to think that there are less people who are killed by sharks than people who have coconuts that fall on their head. But no one in the media wants to make a documentary about coconuts. Nobody wants to talk about coconuts falling on their head. So we kind of associate sharks as being super, super scary and really easy to die from. Well, die from a shark attack. So that's availability heuristic bias. Another one we have is selective bias, is where we reject information that is negative to us. So I listened to this really great podcast on BBC Sounds called Unfollow, and it was about this woman who was part of the Westboro Baptist Church, which is a notorious hate group, and she'd grown up there her whole life, and she actually escaped, and that's what the podcast was about. And she was talking about how when she first had her views challenged, she couldn't accept it. She felt physically ill that somebody would say that Westboro was not the place that she had always thought it was, that it wasn't this kind, welcoming place, and that it was actually hurting people and harming people. So that is selective bias. Now let's move on to systemic bias, which is the most difficult bias to correct because it doesn't happen with groups. It happens with groups, but it's hard to pinpoint. It doesn't come from an individual person's viewpoint. Systemic bias is prejudice towards individuals of an oppressed or marginalized group. And there is a difference between systemic and implicit or unconscious bias. So systemic biases are barriers created by an institution, whereas implicit and unconscious biases are ones that we have like in our heads. So it's the more psychological one. So the biggest systemic bias is racism, and it's a huge issue at the moment. Whilst open racism is much less likely to be encountered, you still have people of colour being oppressed in many ways. In 2018, the Ontario Human Rights looked at racism and found that a black man was nearly 20 times more likely to be shot than a white man by police. And if we think about these kind of statistics that we hear, even when I'm sure all of you heard about BLM in 2020, if you think about how that would apply to an AI, where all of those biases are applied to the AI, but the AI doesn't have empathy like us, it doesn't have emotions like us. So imagine how dangerous that can be and how scary that can be for people who are being oppressed by these kind of beliefs that people have, I guess. So I think that if we think about the examples that I showed, we saw that all of the people who were marginalized were either women or people of color. Now, I'm not we can probably say that it was white men who made these products that have caused this marginalization. Probably, I don't know, but most likely. And there are a few white men in the room, but I'm not trying to attack anyone in this talk that I'm giving. I am simply saying that everyone is unique around you. Everybody has a different experience and will never experience the same kind of prejudice like for example, I will never experience ableism. I just won't. I'll never know it firsthand. So I can understand, but I can't actually know what it's like. And all we can do for other people is be empathetic to the people around us and prioritize creating an environment where it doesn't matter how you're different, because everybody is treated equally. So, you might be thinking, why have I made this talk so depressing? So, I want to think back to Joy and her original prerogative that somebody else will solve this later. We see that someone didn't in her case. No one solved it later. It only took one person to notice that this was a problem, and then positive change quickly followed. Now, we can choose not to, when we choose not to hold ourselves accountable, systemic and implicit biases are almost impossible to get out of, because when we consider ourselves to be an outlier, we remove ourselves from the problem, but that doesn't actually stop the problem, that just stops the problem, you seeing the problem, right? So it only stops us from hearing about it. So if people are, for example, if people of color are racially profiled every day, it doesn't change the fact that, it doesn't change the fact that the harrowing figure of like 96% of women undergo sexual harassment in the UK. It doesn't change the fact, like racial profiling, it doesn't change so many things, it just stops you from being a part of the conversation. And even if you decided as a person that you are perfect, and that you're not biased, and that you always have the right answers, you yourself have created a flaw in yourself. Yeah, so you inherently have created a flaw in yourself if you say you're perfect and you've got all the right biases, because the desire to improve is what makes us better, and the desire to speak up when something isn't just and educate others to make us good people is important, and it's there. If you decided you were perfect, then you would have no desire to think bigger. You would have no desire to achieve more, and this mindset stretches out to groups as well. If Joy had never decided to unpack the bias and change it for the better, who knows if we would have a facial recognition system right now that would work on black faces. If ProPublica had never decided to study Compass, who knows if we would have detected if that black defendants were being treated unfairly. And the list goes on and on. So the main thing I want to say is, when we choose to accept the system for the way that it is, then we limit the chance for the system to be better, and we limit the chance for true equality. Thank you.